Good evening. My name is Ashley Zucker, and this is my presentation for our project, part two, on vertebrate limbs. I'm going to be looking at how vertebrate limbs have developed over time and the circumstances that led to those developments. And quick reminder where we left off in part one. Ended on Sarcopterygians, lobefin fish, and they first appeared in the late Silurian. They had bony elements in the fin lobes that allowed for the rotation of the fin. And these will continue to move from the pectoral girdle into the limb itself. And kind of continuing with Sarcopterygians, we have Porelepiforms. They are sister taxa to our modern lungfish, so they did, at least we believe that they had lungs. They existed from the Devonian into the Carboniferous period, and they lived in shallow marine or brackish water. So the why behind the selective pressures that encourage limb development in aquatic animals, like what's the point of having arms and legs if you live in the water? Why not just keep having fins? That seems to be pretty successful. So in a shallow water environment, it can be a little bit more difficult to navigate when you strictly have just fins. There's not as much water there to support your body weight. And so having something that you can move across the seafloor with is beneficial. Additionally, especially in the Carboniferous where there's a lot of swamps, there's often vegetation choked habitats there. That can be really important to be able to have a method of moving through roots and fallen plants and things like that, not being able to just swim unobstructed through those areas, having essentially limbs to push off of those obstacles in your environment would be beneficial. Also, sometimes these shallow water environments are oxygen poor, and since these animals had lungs, they were able to then use their limbs to push their mouths up out the water so that they could gulp in air. And then, of course, with arthropods moving on the land, their prey options are changing, so it could be beneficial to be able to push your body up out of the water long enough or quick enough to catch prey items. Looking at stem tetrapods, Eusthenopteron, they had a chain of bones from the pectoral girdle into the pectoral fins. They're still very much a fish. You can see Eusthenopteron up here, definitely a fish. And then going into Tiktaalik, the individual that found the first Tiktaalik fossil described it as a fishapod. It's a transitional fossil with an equal mix of basal and derived traits. Looking more closely at Tiktaalik, we can see specifically that it does have those both of those ancestral and derived traits. It has fin rays. There's no olecranon process, and the radius is shorter than the ulna. The elbow is straight, and the hip structure is still very fish-like. Derived traits, fin rays are shorter. So even though it still has fin rays, they're shorter. They do have distal bones that form the basis for digits. The pectoral fins have joints that can bend, so it's like a wrist, allows the animal to prop itself up. And there's some flexion through the elbow. The limbs can also rotate, and then the hip structure does begin to take on some tetrapod characteristics. Moving into Acanthostega and Ichthyostega, these animals are both still primarily aquatic. Acanthostega has more basal characteristics. The ulna has the beginnings of an olecranon process. It has a tripartite pelvis with ischium for hind limb muscle connection, but it's relatively weak connections there. It's not particularly robust versus Ichthyostega, very robust limbs, very robust digits. It does have a proper clavicle, humerus, radius, and ulna, and then also, again, digits. There is an olecranon process on the ulna. It is polydactyl, so it has 8 digits instead of the ancestral 4, and a very robust pelvis. You can look at the image there and see how big that pelvis is in relation to the rest of the body versus, Acanthostega with a hardly noticeable pelvis at all. Looking specifically at the transition to land, quickly, I'm going to address the image in the back. I took that from the lecture slides, but I thought it was a good representation of just how much limb morphology has changed from Glyptolepis over here on the left, all the way up to Telerpeton on the right, where you can see that there is a very definable humerus there, radius, ulna, and then those 5 digits, and then everything in between. Looking at batrachomorphs, so that includes temnospondyls and Lissamphibia. Temnospondyls existed at the end of the Devonian, but there was a lot of radiation in the Carboniferous period. Temnal spondylus are ancestral to anurines and caudates. They might be ancestral to Gymnophiona, but that lineage is more disputed. It's possible that leptospondylus are the ancestral versions of today's Sicilians. They existed in aquatic, semi-aquatic, and terrestrial environments. They possessed fully formed limbs with scapula, humerus, femurs, radius, ulnas, or tibia and fibula in the hind limbs, clavicles, and digits. In Lissamphibia, so that's today's Sicilians, salamanders, and frogs. They have 4 digits or fewer. So with Gymnophiona, these are Sicilians. All limbs are lost. They exist in primarily fossorial environments, so they're burrowing or they're completely aquatic. There is no need for limbs. Limbs are actually a hindrance in that kind of environment. With caudates, they generally have 4 limbs that are roughly the same length with the fore and hind limbs. However, some salamanders only have front limbs, and then with frogs and toads, they're specialized jumpers. There is a tremendous amount of differentiation between fore and hind limb length. Again, going to look at anurines, they move by saltation largely. Those features originally evolved, though, for life in the water, using hind limb powered locomotion while swimming. They have extremely long legs, long femurs, their tib and fib are fused, and there's a long ilium in the pelvis. That's really well adapted for jumping. Front legs are short and sturdy to assist with landing. Just to note some current research, Buttermer et al. Looked at 230 species of anurines from diverse microhabitats and found that hind limb and pelvic morphology is strongly associated with microhabitat and method of locomotion. Going into the reptiliomorphs, anthracosaurs, and stem amniotes from the Carboniferous onward. 5 digits, so they had that pentadactyly going on. They are completely terrestrial or secondarily aquatic. Their limbs are robust and well developed for terrestrial life. Amniotes have some unique limb features. They have an astragalus bone and a mesotarsal joint that allows for the foot to act as a lever, which is important for limb-based rather than axial locomotion. In synapsids, there's a calcaneal heel that serves as a point of attachment for the gastrocnemius muscle and the Achilles tendon. Synapsids and sauropsids. Early synapsids had short limbs and more sprawling posture, but eventually they developed some derived characteristics where the limbs move underneath the body, which allowed for locomotion without bending the trunk. That allows ventilation and movement to work together. Sauropsids also had a sprawling posture, though some more derived groups eventually developed bipedalism. Modern crocodilians and squamates also possess a sprawled out body plan. So you can see the difference between the Dimetrodon and this lizard here. Looking at Lepidosauria, specifically chose to look at serpentes and limb reduction. Limb loss is actually developed over 60 times in the squamates. That includes legless lizards, amphisbaenians, and snakes. It's likely a response to thick vegetation, dense rock piles, or a fossorial lifestyle. Forelimb loss is more common than hind limb loss in these animals. And then some snakes, pythonids in particular, retain vestigial limbs in the form of pelvic spurs. So according to Leal and Cohn, embryonic pythons actually develop rear limb buds with tissue for the femur, tib, fib, and foot, but this disappears before hatching. You can see there's that vestigial, there's a spur. This part right here sticks out of the body by the vent. or the cloaca, and then there's the rest of this structure